Alright, so we're going to move along to Chapter 4, which is about doing literature reviews. So imagine this. It's Monday morning. You've come to school or work or whatever social place, and you find there's this group that's just kind of hanging around outside. They're discussing the controversial call from last night's football game, right? So you have two choices. Do you A, approach the group, listen for a minute, try and catch the thread of the conversation, and then try to figure out how you can contribute meaningfully to this conversation? Or B, approach the group, immediately begin to loudly babble every random fact you think you know about football in hopes that someone will find something that you say to be interesting. So if you picked option B, well, you probably need to go get help. Most socially intelligent people would pick option A, to listen to the conversation, find out what people are talking about, and then find a way to contribute meaningfully to that conversation. In a nutshell, that's really why we're doing a literature review. It's not really about one person on the mountaintop laboratory making random discoveries about the nature of the universe. That's not what research is about. Rather, it's done as a community. We are a community of researchers. And in this community, there are active conversations that are taking place. At times, sometimes these conversations are like arguments. Most often, it's more of a collaborative tone. We are all trying to work together collaboratively to build a body of knowledge that we can rely on. So when you're coming to a research topic, it's a good idea to get the entire conversation, to get yourself really well informed about what people are talking about on this topic. You want to avoid cherry picking just the sources or the parts of the conversation that are going to support sort of a preformed position. That's not really scientific. That's what they call bias, which we need to avoid in doing research. A strong literature review should be able to stand up to and address criticisms from other voices that are in the field. A good literature review should be able to take all of this information and summarize it and synthesize it to come up with a strong original position on the topic. And this can include critically engaging with arguments from other voices or other positions in the field. Additionally, you need to know what conversations are taking place so you can figure out how your own study is going to meaningfully add to them. There's no sense in doing a study that's already been done. I mean, why would you, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you can certainly improve on the wheel using or building on prior wheel research, and give the credit where credit is due, of course. But that's how progress is made, is that we further sort of the advances of previous studies. So if you recall from the previous lecture notes, and I was making kind of a big deal about how the research study is guided by a research question, right? And everything flows from that research question and needs to serve answering that research question. A review of literature is going to help you ask an informed research question. It can also help inform your design. So let's say that I'm doing a qualitative grounded theory study on the process of students who are developing sort of a theoretical orientation towards counseling. I'm sure somebody's already done this study. As part of the study, I would want to interview some participants. Contrary to what Glasser says, and I think that's a quote from page 89 in your text, a literature review is actually going to help us ask interview questions that are likely to yield data that'll be helpful in answering the research question. Without doing that literature review, we don't know what is the most relevant kind of area that we need to focus on. We just start asking questions and it'd be kind of like shooting in the dark. Reviewing literature could tell us that in counselor development, one of the most important areas to look at is actually in the practicum experience. And so that might be an area that we want to focus on when we're doing our interviews. It's also important to kind of keep in mind that when you look at that reference in the text, Glasser's point of view on avoiding the literature review until after data is collected, definitely in the minority. Most qualitative researchers and all quantitative researchers agree that a literature review is important. Similarly, when we're doing observations, we also want to be guided in what it is that we're observing. We can't possibly observe everything at once. As like subjective human beings, we have kind of a frame of reference that we have to pay attention to, a few things or certain things, but not necessarily everything. It's not possible. If in the literature it says that peer conversations are very important in developing a theory, then I'm going to be looking for those peer interactions when I do observations. So, you're asking informed research questions, you're using the existing literature to help guide your research design. Then when your study is over, you want to go back to the literature once again to just see how your findings or your results of your study compare to what's already known, or how does your study fit into what we already know. Does it agree with other studies, or does it contradict maybe some things that other people have believed? What are the implications of your study for the field going forward, the future of this topic? So far we've been looking at literature reviews from the perspective of doing research. I want to sort of give you maybe another perspective as well on why doing a literature review is important and sort of how it functions as a literary device in a research article. As we've already noted, the first thing that the literature review does is communicate that you're informed about the conversation that's already in progress, right? You know a little bit about what you're talking about. It also situates and embeds your study in the context of this greater conversation that's happening, right? So you're not doing like an isolated study, you're actually doing a study within a context of other research that's out there. And so it's important to note how your work relates to other works that have been done in the area. Secondly, we stand on the shoulders of giants and borrow their authority when we do a literature review. For example, I could claim that when we speak, we use these acoustic sounds to refer to these mental concepts, right? Words related to ideas. And that we can study the relationship between these things in a sort of holistic way. But seriously, who's this Maxfield guy, right? He's just stating, and it might be an interesting opinion, but it's unfounded, right? It's just me talking. But in 1916, Ferdinand de Saussure was a philosopher who talked about the relationship between signifiers and signifieds, between words and things or concepts. If I cite de Saussure, I've got what's called citational authority. I've got him in my corner backing up my claims, right? People know and respect who de Saussure is. He's been published, and his ideas have been accepted in the academic community. Therefore, it's not just me talking out of the opposite end of my digestive tract. I have somebody to back me up. So also in doing a literature review, you're going to demonstrate why anyone should care about your study. You explain how the study is going to add to this conversation that's already happening in the field in a meaningful way, right? Why it's important for people to read your study. And you communicate the practical importance of the study as well. How is it going to impact people in the real world? In a sense, lit review can be kind of like selling your study to your readers, right? You're basically saying, here's what's being said in this conversation already. Here's what hasn't been said yet, but I'm intending to say it, and it's going to be important, and it's going to make the whole conversation much more awesome, so you should really listen to this. Finally, the lit review is needed to kind of set the stage for your study. What you're doing is you're providing all of the information that's necessary for your readers to fully understand and appreciate the study the way that you want them to. So to give you another example, also football related because it's that time of year. My partner and I, we went out to sort of a bar and we were having food and drinks and stuff, and there was a football game on. And so she really doesn't understand anything about football, zero concept of it. And so she was watching, and she had no idea why people were cheering or what they were cheering at. And she was like, why are all those guys just jumping all over each other? Like, this doesn't make any sense. It's a crazy game, right?
And Ron Winter just got buried. Oh. And then, of course, he's underneath the scrum going for the football, and Ron Winter all but disappears.
The fact is, Football has a clear set of rules and strategies for winning. But since my partner didn't have a literature review to give her an understanding of what those rules were, everything seemed just really random and chaotic to her, and she didn't understand it. The lit reviews should tell your readers everything they need to know in order for them to appreciate the study the way that you want them to. Right? Let's talk a little bit about theoretical frameworks. As I noted before, quantitative researchers tend to operate from the logical positivist framework. It values objectivity and empirical measurements. But qualitative researchers, on the other hand, they rejected that framework, if you remember. They don't believe that it's possible to know anything from this objective or disembodied perspective. We all bring unique perspectives to whatever it is we research, which means that any given phenomenon can be looked at from a number of different perspectives. This is sometimes referred to as the Rashomon effect, after the classic Japanese film by Akira Kurosawa, in which the same event is told several times from several different perspectives. What this means is that the researcher must be intentional about the perspective that they bring to the research project. It's not simply about reporting what is, like you would from an objective perspective, but rather reporting how a phenomenon is examined and made sense of. In other words, qualitative researchers often develop a theoretical framework, which is a kind of lens that helps them understand the study in a particular way. Theoretical frameworks often come from philosophies of inquiry and epistemology. For example, my dissertation is going to use Deleuze and Guattari's ideas of the machinic assemblage, which is kind of a postmodern theory, as a framework for understanding how families change from addiction to sobriety. Of course, there are other ways to understand the same transformation. For example, you could use a Bowenian family systems theory, or you could use like Freudian psychoanalytic perspectives, or any other number of different theories to explain the same thing. So we've been talking about what a literature review is and what it does for a research article. Let's talk a little bit more about how you actually conduct a literature review. Now, a good literature review is often said to be comprehensive, and this idea of being comprehensive is often very overwhelming, especially for people who are new to the process of doing research. So let's say we're looking at children's cognitive development. Now, there's been a ton of work that's been done in this area over like this last century or century and a half, and it would take more than a lifetime to just read all of the material that's out there. However, you should know that a lot of the literature that's out there, especially the older literature, is probably obsolete and out of date. It might be of value for historical purposes. Sometimes you might want to go back and say, well, this is how people understood things. The exception, of course, is what are known as seminal works. Basically, these are the important texts that influence the thought on the subject. So, in the case of the cognitive development, you don't need to cite everything, but if you're not at least familiar with Freud, Piaget, Vygotsky, or Bandura, you'd probably be considered poorly informed about the topic. So in addition to familiarity with seminal works, a literature review will look at relevant current research as well. People's definition of what actually counts as current varies from person to person. I've heard that anything that's been published in the past 15 years can be fair game, and there are others that claim that anything that's older than 5 years is already out of date.